This is the full documentary on the rise and fall of Colin Hendry, a man who had everything and lost it all. Once upon a time, Colin Hendry stood as a towering figure in Scottish and English football. His name was spoken with reverence across 2 decades of professional play. He was the formidable central defender who helped Blackburn Rovers secure the English Premiership title in 1995. He was the captain who proudly led Scotland during their 1998 World Cup campaign. He was the player who contributed to Rangers' Scottish domestic treble in the 1998-99 season. Colin Hendry was more than just a footballer. He was a football legend, a national hero who commanded respect both on and off the pitch. His professional career spanned 20 years, during which he showcased remarkable influence and leadership. He was instrumental in some of the most memorable moments in British football. At Blackburn Rovers, he formed part of a defence that helped secure the most unlikely Premier League title victory. His partnership with other defenders became legendary among football fans. His aerial ability, his commanding presence in tackles, his unwavering leadership from the back, all these qualities made him one of the most respected defenders of his generation. When Blackburn Rovers lifted the Premier League trophy in 1995, Colin Hendry was at the heart of their success. The achievement was remarkable, considering they were competing against football giants like Manchester United, Liverpool and Arsenal. Hendry's defensive prowess and leadership were crucial elements in what many consider one of the greatest underdog stories in Premier League history. His performances that season demonstrated not just technical ability, but the kind of mental strength and determination that separates good players from truly great ones. On the international stage, Hendry's prowess was equally impressive and inspiring. He proudly captained Scotland during the 1998 World Cup campaign in France. Leading his country onto the world's biggest stage represented the absolute pinnacle of his playing career. The respect he commanded from teammates and opponents alike was evident in every match he played. He was a cornerstone of Scottish football during one of its most competitive and memorable eras. His leadership on the pitch was matched by his dignity and professionalism off it. The responsibility of captaining Scotland at a World Cup cannot be understated. It represents the trust and confidence of an entire nation. The belief that one individual possesses the character, skill and leadership qualities necessary to represent millions of people on the world stage. Hendry carried this responsibility with pride and distinction, becoming a symbol of Scottish football excellence and determination. After hanging up his boots, Hendry smoothly transitioned into management and coaching roles. He held managerial positions at clubs such as Blackpool and Clyde, bringing his wealth of playing, experience and tactical knowledge to a new generation of players. He also served as assistant manager at Boston United and Blackburn Rovers, the club where he had achieved his greatest playing success. His football knowledge, tactical understanding, and natural leadership skills seemed to promise a bright and successful future beyond his playing days. This was a man who had achieved peak performance in the public eye, celebrated and admired by millions of fans across the globe. His transition into coaching suggested that his contributions to football would continue long after his playing career ended. He possessed the kind of football intelligence and leadership qualities that typically translate well into successful coaching careers. The respect he commanded from players and colleagues seemed to guarantee continued success in his post-playing career. His achievements were recognised not just by fans and media, but by his peers throughout the football world. Fellow professionals acknowledged his skill, dedication and leadership. His reputation extended beyond Scotland and England to international recognition as one of the premier defenders of his era. This was a man who'd built a legacy of excellence, professionalism and sporting achievement that should have provided a foundation for lifelong respect and success. But how does a celebrated champion, a hero to millions of supporters, end up bankrupt with a criminal record? How does someone who once lifted prestigious trophies and captained his country on the world stage spiral into a life of public shame, financial ruin, and legal troubles? How does a man who represented the very best of professional football become associated with exploitation, harassment, and criminal behaviour. The story of Colin Hendry's downfall is one that begins with genuine tragedy, but it quickly becomes a story of destructive personal choices, character flaws, and demons that would systematically tear apart everything he had built during his illustrious career. It is a story that reveals how quickly a lifetime of achievement can be destroyed by poor decisions and destructive behaviour. It shows how personal tragedy, while deserving of sympathy, cannot excuse or justify the exploitation of others or the abandonment of basic human decency. The catalyst for Colin Hendry's eventual destruction began on what seemed like an ordinary day. In April 2002, his wife Denise made a decision that would change their lives forever, though neither could have anticipated the devastating consequences that would follow. She wanted to undergo cosmetic surgery, specifically a tummy tuck procedure, to help her regain her figure after giving birth to their fourth child. It seemed like a routine elective procedure at the private Broughton Park Hospital in Preston. Denise was motivated by a desire that many mothers share, to feel confident in her body again after childbirth. She had given birth to 4 children and wanted to restore her pre-pregnancy figure through what should have been a straightforward cosmetic procedure. There was nothing unusual or unreasonable about her decision. Thousands of women undergo similar procedures every year without serious complications. She had every reason to expect a successful outcome that would help her feel better about herself. The choice of the private Broughton Park Hospital seemed sensible at the time. Private healthcare often promises more personalised attention and care, shorter waiting times, and access to experienced specialists. The family likely felt that they were making a responsible choice by choosing private care for what they viewed as an important but routine procedure. But this seemingly simple cosmetic operation would become the beginning of 7 years of absolute hell for the entire Hendry family. What happened next would test every aspect of their resilience, drain their emotional and financial resources, and ultimately set in motion the events that would destroy Colin Hendry's post-football life. The surgery went catastrophically and inexcusably wrong. What should have been a straightforward procedure turned into a medical nightmare that would haunt the family for years to come. The operation resulted in 9 punctures to Denise's bowel and colon, a shocking level of surgical incompetence that defies explanation. These punctures were not minor complications or acceptable surgical risks, but clear evidence of negligent and substandard medical care. The 9 punctures led directly to severe blood poisoning, medically known as septicemia, which triggered multiple organ failure throughout her body. The complications were so severe and life-threatening that her heart actually stopped beating for 4 terrifying minutes due to cardiac arrest. For those 4 minutes, Denise Hendry was clinically dead, saved only by emergency medical intervention that managed to restart her heart and bring her back from the brink of death. Initially, the medical team gave Denise only a 10% chance of survival. The extent of the complications and the severity of the organ failure made her prognosis extremely poor. She faced the very real possibility of death as a direct result of what was supposed to be a routine cosmetic procedure. The fact that she survived those initial critical hours was considered almost miraculous by the medical professionals treating her. She endured a grueling 3-month hospital stay, fighting for her life while her family watched helplessly from her bedside. This marked the beginning of what would become a prolonged 7-year struggle for any semblance of recovery or normal life. The procedure that was supposed to boost her confidence and help her feel better about herself instead initiated a medical ordeal that would consume the family's emotional, physical, and financial resources for the remainder of her life. The impact on the entire Hendry family during this initial crisis cannot be overstated. Colin watched his wife fight for survival in intensive care, never knowing from day to day whether she would live or die. Their 4 children, Regan, Kyle, Callum and Neve, had to cope with the possibility of losing their mother due to a completely preventable medical error. The family's entire world was turned upside down by circumstances that should never have occurred. For nearly a decade, the Hendry family lived under a continuous cloud of medical crisis and uncertainty. Denise underwent numerous complex corrective surgeries, each one an attempt to repair the damage caused by the original botched procedure. Each surgical intervention brought its own risks, complications, and further physical and emotional suffering. The family's collective resilience was slowly being eroded by this prolonged trauma that seemed to have no end in sight. The psychological toll on the entire family during this period was enormous. Colin watched his wife endure procedure after procedure, never knowing if the next surgery would finally provide relief or create new complications. The uncertainty was constant and exhausting. Every hospital admission brought hope that this time the problems might be resolved, followed by disappointment when new complications arose or previous repairs failed. Their 4 children grew up watching their mother battle medical complications that should never have existed. Instead of normal childhood experiences, they lived with the constant fear of losing their mother and the stress of ongoing medical crises. Family life was dominated by hospital visits, medical consultations, and the emotional rollercoaster of hope and disappointment that characterized Denise's long struggle for recovery. The financial pressure on the family during this period was also significant. While they would eventually receive compensation, the immediate costs of ongoing private medical care, travel to specialists, time away from work, and the countless expenses associated with serious illness began to accumulate. This financial stress added another layer of pressure to an already overwhelming situation. The emotional impact on Colin specifically was profound and would later contribute to his destructive choices. Watching someone you love suffer for years due to preventable medical negligence creates a unique form of trauma. The combination of grief, anger, helplessness, and frustration that Colin experienced during this period would later manifest in destructive ways when combined with his own character flaws and poor decision-making. Her final hospitalisation in 2009 involved an 11-week stay at Salford Royal Hospital for further reconstructive abdominal surgery. Even after 7 years of medical interventions, corrective procedures, and ongoing treatment, Denise was still fighting the consequences of that original botched cosmetic surgery. The fact that she required major abdominal reconstruction 7 years after the initial procedure demonstrates the severity and persistence of the complications caused by the original surgical negligence. During this final hospital stay, she tragically contracted a fatal meningitis-type infection. After fighting for so long, after enduring so much pain and so many failed attempts at surgical repair, Denise's body finally succumbed to complications that could be directly traced back to the medical negligence that occurred nearly a decade earlier. The infection that ultimately killed her was a direct consequence of her weakened condition and the ongoing medical interventions required to address the original surgical errors. On July 10, 2009, Denise Hendry died at the age of just 43 from a post-operative infection that was later confirmed by an inquest to be meningitis. Her death represented the end of a 7-year battle that should never have been necessary. She died far too young, leaving behind 4 children and a husband who would struggle to cope with the loss in healthy and constructive ways. Throughout her final ordeal, Colin remained steadfastly at her bedside, a testament to his unwavering support and love for his wife. This dedication during her illness represents one of the more positive aspects of his character during this crisis period. He could have abandoned her or minimized his involvement in her care, but instead he remained committed to supporting her through every stage of her medical struggles. He publicly praised her as beautiful inside and out, and described her as a real fighter, acknowledging her immense courage and resilience through unimaginable suffering. These statements reflect a genuine appreciation for her strength and determination in facing circumstances that would have broken many people. His recognition of her courage and beauty, even in the face of years of medical complications, shows his capacity for love and support during the most difficult circumstances. The family had previously secured a 6-figure damages settlement in November 2006, a legal acknowledgement of the medical negligence that caused Denise's initial injuries and years of subsequent suffering. While no amount of money could compensate for what the family endured, this settlement provided some measure of justice and financial relief for the enormous costs associated with her ongoing medical care. The surgeon responsible for the botched procedure, Dr. Gustaf Jansen, voluntarily removed himself from the General Medical Council's register and ceased practicing medicine in the United Kingdom. This action represented a clear acknowledgement of responsibility and accountability for the surgical catastrophe that destroyed a family's life. The fact that he stopped practicing medicine entirely suggests recognition of the severity of his error and its consequences. Colin's own words from that time reveal the depth of his anger and profound sense of betrayal that would later contribute to his destructive choices and poor decision-making. It's easy to look back now and say how we wish she hadn't gone to Anjansen, but she did, and we're having to live with the awful consequences of that man's negligence. The operation he undertook went dreadfully wrong and Denise nearly died. This statement reveals several important elements of Colin's emotional state during this period. The anger is clear and understandable. His wife nearly died and ultimately did die as a result of preventable medical negligence. The sense of betrayal by a medical professional who was supposed to help his wife instead nearly killed her immediately and ultimately caused her death years later. This deep-seated anger and feeling of betrayal would add a complex and volatile layer to his emotional state, potentially fueling the struggles and poor choices that would follow Denise's death. The combination of grief over his loss, anger at the medical system that failed his family, and frustration at his inability to protect his wife from suffering would create an emotional cocktail that Colin would struggle to manage in healthy ways. The profound personal impact of Denise's death extended far beyond Colin and their 4 children. Close friends such as Hector MacFarlane, who had helped carry Denise's coffin during her funeral, also felt the immense weight of this tragedy. The MacFarlanes had been close family friends who supported the Hendrys throughout Denise's long illness. Their willingness to serve as pallbearers demonstrated the depth of their friendship and their genuine grief over her death. But this wasn't merely grief over the death of a loved one. This was grief compounded by a pervasive sense of injustice and preventable loss due to clear medical negligence. Everyone who knew and loved Denise understood that her death could have been avoided if she had received competent medical care during what should have been a routine procedure. The knowledge that her suffering and death were unnecessary added layers of anger and resentment to an already devastating loss. The impact on the broader community was also significant. Denise's tragic passing became a cautionary tale with important public health implications. Her case highlighted the very real and potentially fatal dangers of elective cosmetic surgery, particularly procedures performed by incompetent practitioners. Her story served as a wake-up call for others considering similar procedures, particularly women seeking to regain their pre-pregnancy figures. Her early death underscored the critical need for individuals to thoroughly research and assess the qualifications of surgeons, the safety records of facilities, and the potential risks involved in cosmetic surgery. What began as a personal family tragedy was elevated into a matter of significant societal concern, helping to raise awareness about the importance of careful decision-making when considering elective medical procedures. The media coverage of her case also helped highlight broader issues about regulation and oversight in the cosmetic surgery industry. Her story contributed to discussions about the need for better training, stricter standards, and more effective oversight of practitioners who perform elective cosmetic procedures. While the death of his wife was undoubtedly tragic and would test anyone's emotional resilience and coping abilities, what followed revealed deeply troubling aspects of Colin Hendry's character and decision-making that cannot be excused or explained away by grief alone. The choices he made in response to his loss would prove to be far more destructive than the original tragedy, and would ultimately cause harm to many innocent people who had tried to support him. In the wake of Denise's death, Rather than seeking healthy support systems, professional counselling, or constructive ways to process his grief, Hendry made choices that revealed fundamental character flaws and a willingness to prioritise his immediate desires over the well-being of others. His response to tragedy would ultimately prove more damaging to his family, friends, and reputation than the original loss itself. He openly admitted to turning to alcohol and gambling as his primary coping mechanisms during this difficult period. He described this phase of his life as a destructive cycle that was fueled by his overwhelming grief. In his own words, "I did drink quite a lot initially, and I gambled, not as badly as has been reported." While he attempted to downplay the extent of his gambling problems, the evidence would later prove that his addiction was far more severe and destructive than he was willing to acknowledge. This self-admission confirms a direct and troubling connection between his personal tragedy and his adoption of these clearly maladaptive and destructive behaviours. Rather than seeking proper counselling, professional therapy, support from friends and family, or other healthy ways to process his grief and anger, Hendry chose to escape into substances and compulsive gambling activities. The overwhelming emotional pain and trauma of losing his wife, particularly after such a prolonged and agonising illness caused by medical negligence, led him to seek solace in behaviours that would ultimately make his situation exponentially worse. The depth of his grief may have initially overwhelmed his previous coping mechanisms, pushing him towards self-medication and escapism that then spiralled into serious addiction and compulsive behaviours. However, what makes his choices particularly problematic is that these weren't temporary responses to acute grief that he addressed once the initial shock wore off. Instead, these behaviours became established patterns that continued for years and ultimately caused more damage to his life and relationships than the original tragedy. His turn to alcohol and gambling wasn't just about managing immediate grief. It became a destructive lifestyle that defined his post-football existence point. The severity of Hendry's gambling problem became particularly evident through its direct and undeniable link to his eventual financial ruin. SpreadX, an online betting firm to whom Hendry owed substantial money, was the very entity that initiated his bankruptcy proceedings. This fact unequivocally establishes gambling not merely as a symptom of his emotional distress, but as a significant and active contributor to his accumulating debt and ultimate financial destruction. His gambling addiction accelerated his financial downfall far beyond what might be expected from general poor money management, reduced income, or even significant medical expenses. This wasn't casual recreational gambling that got slightly out of hand during a period of emotional vulnerability. This was a serious and destructive addiction that consumed his financial resources and ultimately destroyed his economic stability entirely. The fact that a betting company took legal action to force him into bankruptcy reveals both the extent of his gambling debts and his complete inability to control his compulsive behaviour, even when facing financial ruin. SpreadX wouldn't have initiated expensive legal proceedings unless the amount owed was substantial and all other collection efforts had failed. Their willingness to pursue bankruptcy proceedings indicates that Hendry's gambling debts were significant enough to justify the time and expense of formal legal action. What makes Hendry's financial situation even more damning and inexcusable is that evidence clearly suggests his money problems were not solely a consequence of his wife's death and his subsequent grief-driven poor choices. His financial difficulties had actually begun to manifest well before this profound tragedy struck his family, indicating fundamental problems with financial responsibility and money management that predated his emotional crisis. In January 2009, a full 5 months before Denise passed away, Hendry revealed his precarious financial situation in a desperate email to his close friend Hector McFarlane. The timing of this communication is crucial because it demonstrates that his financial problems existed independently of his grief and cannot be entirely attributed to his emotional response to loss. In this email, Hendry stated, "Cash flow is zero and the vultures are circling. only because I'm not working, no income as such. This stark admission indicates that he was already experiencing serious financial problems even while his wife was still alive and fighting her medical battles. The fact that he described creditors as vultures circling suggests that his debt situation was already quite serious, and that multiple creditors were actively pursuing him for payment of overdue obligations. The phrase, "cash flow is zero," indicates that he had no liquid assets or regular income sufficient to meet his ongoing financial obligations. This wasn't a temporary cash shortage or a minor financial inconvenience. This was a complete inability to pay his bills or service his existing debts. The fact that he attributed this situation to not working suggests that he was already experiencing reduced income, but the extent of his problems indicates deeper issues than simple unemployment. He also explicitly mentioned in his correspondence that he needed money due to a letter he had received from the Inland Revenue, which signalled that he was already facing significant tax problems with HM Revenue and Customs well before his wife's death. Tax problems typically develop over extended periods and indicate systematic failure to meet basic financial obligations as a citizen. The fact that HMRC was already pursuing him for unpaid taxes suggests a pattern of financial irresponsibility that had been developing for some time. This timeline reveals that while grief and his subsequent destructive behaviours of drinking and gambling were certainly major contributors to his eventual bankruptcy, these problems landed on an already fundamentally unstable financial foundation. His poor money management, existing debt problems, and failure to meet tax obligations meant that he was already teetering on the edge of financial disaster when the additional pressures of grief and addiction pushed him completely over into complete financial ruin. The pre-existing nature of his financial problems suggests fundamental issues with money management, financial planning, and personal responsibility that cannot be attributed to emotional trauma or temporary poor judgment. These were ongoing problems that reflected deeper character issues and poor decision-making that would later be amplified by his response to personal tragedy. In a desperate and ultimately destructive attempt to manage his mounting debts, Hendry made choices that would reveal the absolute worst aspects of his character and his willingness to exploit the people who cared about him most. He systematically turned to those people who were closest to him and who trusted him most, deliberately exploiting their personal relationships and their genuine concern for his family's welfare for short-term financial relief. His most significant and damaging exploitation involved securing £85,000 from Hector and Williamina McFarlane, who were not just casual acquaintances or business contacts, but genuinely close friends who had been deeply involved in his family's life for years. The McFarlanes had supported the Hendry family throughout Denise's long illness, providing emotional support and practical assistance during the most difficult period of their lives. The McFarlanes were so close to the Hendry family that they had actually helped carry Denise's coffin during her funeral, demonstrating the extraordinary depth of their personal bond and friendship. Their willingness to serve as pallbearers showed their genuine love and respect for Denise and their deep commitment to supporting the family during their grief. This level of involvement in such a personal and sacred ceremony indicates a relationship built on years of trust, mutual respect, and genuine affection. Their willingness to lend Colin such a substantial amount of money during his time of apparent need showed the trust and confidence they felt in him as a friend, and the genuine compassion they felt for his family's situation. They likely believed they were helping a grieving friend through a temporary financial difficulty, never imagining that they were actually financing his gambling addiction and supporting unsustainable spending habits. However, Hendry's exploitation of this friendship for money he had no realistic prospect of repaying would later destroy their relationship entirely and lead to consequences that would harm everyone involved, including his own family members. His willingness to take advantage of people who had demonstrated such loyalty and support during his family's crisis reveals fundamental character flaws that cannot be excused by grief or emotional distress. But borrowing from the McFarlanes was just the beginning of Hendry's systematic exploitation of personal relationships for financial gain. The full extent of his willingness to take advantage of family and friends becomes clear when examining the complete picture of his borrowing behaviour during this period. His approach to managing his financial problems involved systematically extracting money from everyone who cared about him, regardless of their own financial situations or the impact his borrowing might have on their lives. He also owed £65,000 to his late father's estate, essentially taking money that should have been preserved as part of his father's legacy for future generations. This borrowing from a deceased parent's estate represents a particularly troubling form of financial irresponsibility, as it involves taking resources that were meant to honour his father's memory and provide for the family's long-term financial security. He borrowed £35,000 from his own brother, putting enormous strain on a family relationship during an already difficult time when the family was dealing with Denise's illness and death. Family members often feel obligated to help during crises, but Hendry's borrowing put his brother in an impossible position of either providing financial support the family couldn't afford or refusing to help during a family emergency. Most shockingly of all, he even owed £10,000 to Denise's parents, borrowing money from the grieving parents of his deceased wife. This represents perhaps the most callous and inexcusable aspect of his financial exploitation. These people were dealing with their own grief over the loss of their daughter, yet Hendry was willing to take their money to support his gambling addiction and unsustainable lifestyle. The manipulation and deception involved in these transactions becomes even more apparent when considering that Hendry specifically asked the McFarlanes to keep their loan secret from Denise during her final illness. He explicitly requested that they not tell his dying wife about the money he was borrowing, ostensibly to avoid worrying her during her medical struggles and final battle with the complications from her surgery. While this request might seem considerate on the surface, protecting a dying woman from additional stress about financial problems, it actually demonstrates his willingness to deceive his wife about the true extent of his financial desperation, while simultaneously exploiting the goodwill and trust of their closest friends. This deception allowed him to continue his destructive spending and gambling while maintaining the appearance of financial stability to his dying wife. This pattern of borrowing reveals someone who was willing to systematically exploit every personal relationship he had for short-term financial relief, regardless of the long-term consequences for those relationships or the impact on the people who trusted him. He took money from friends who had supported his family through their darkest hours. He borrowed from family members who trusted him and wanted to help during what they believed was a temporary crisis. He even exploited the grief and compassion of his dead wife's parents, taking their money while they were mourning the loss of their daughter. The systematic nature of this borrowing suggests a deliberate strategy rather than desperate acts driven by temporary emotional distress. He methodically approached everyone in his personal network who might be willing to provide financial assistance, extracting as much money as possible from each relationship, while concealing the true extent of his problems and his inability to repay what he owed. Colin Hendry was formally declared bankrupt on June 23, 2010, less than a year after his wife's death. The timing of his bankruptcy, following so closely after Denise's death, might suggest a connection between his financial collapse and his grief. However, the evidence clearly shows that his financial problems predated his wife's death and were accelerated rather than caused by his subsequent destructive behaviours. The bankruptcy proceedings were initiated by Spreadex, the online betting firm, directly linking his gambling addiction to his complete financial collapse. The fact that a gambling company was forced to take legal action to recover their money provides clear evidence that his financial problems were significantly driven by compulsive gambling rather than circumstances beyond his control or temporary emotional poor judgment. His total debt was reported to be a staggering £2.2 million, a sum that represents complete and total financial irresponsibility on a scale that is difficult to comprehend. This wasn't a case of someone who had fallen behind on a few payments or was struggling with temporary cash flow problems. This was systematic financial destruction that involved multiple creditors, enormous tax liabilities, and complete failure to meet basic financial obligations over an extended period. The largest single creditor in his bankruptcy was HM Revenue and Customs, to whom he owed £1.3 million in unpaid taxes. This enormous tax liability indicates that Hendry had been systematically failing to pay his taxes for an extended period, showing a pattern of financial irresponsibility that went far beyond his gambling debts or grief-related poor judgment. The magnitude of his tax debt suggests that he had been earning significant income over multiple years, but had failed to set aside money to pay his tax obligations. This represents a fundamental failure to meet one of the most basic responsibilities of citizenship, and indicates either complete financial illiteracy or willful disregard for his legal obligations. Prior to being forced into bankruptcy, Hendry had attempted to arrange an individual voluntary arrangement to manage his debts and avoid the stigma and legal consequences of formal bankruptcy proceedings. An IVA represents a formal agreement between a debtor and their creditors to pay back a portion of what is owed over an extended period, typically allowing the debtor to avoid bankruptcy while providing creditors with some prospect of recovering their money. However, Hendry's proposed IVA was rejected by more than 55% of his creditors, indicating that they had completely lost confidence in his ability to repay what he owed or to manage his finances responsibly going forward. Creditors typically accept IVA proposals when they believe the arrangement offers a better prospect of recovery than bankruptcy proceedings. The fact that a majority of his creditors rejected his proposal suggests they believed he was fundamentally unreliable, and that bankruptcy was the only viable option for recovering any of their money. The sale of his assets during the bankruptcy process reveals the extent to which his previous lifestyle had been built on borrowed money and completely unsustainable debt rather than genuine wealth or financial security. His substantial £1.7 million Grade 2 listed mansion in Lytham, Lancashire, was sold as part of the bankruptcy proceedings. This property represented his most valuable asset and should have provided significant resources for repaying his creditors. However, the sale proceeds were reportedly only sufficient to cover the existing mortgages and secured loans against the property, leaving very little money available for the unsecured creditors who had trusted him with their money. This outcome suggests that even his most valuable asset was heavily encumbered with debt, and that his apparent wealth and comfortable lifestyle had been largely financed through borrowing rather than genuine financial success. The fact that the sale of such a valuable property provided minimal relief for his creditors indicates the extent to which his entire financial life had been built on unsustainable foundations. His apparent prosperity and comfortable lifestyle had been maintained through systematic borrowing and debt accumulation, rather than genuine financial management or wealth creation. The outcome of Hendry's bankruptcy proceedings reveals how legal systems designed to provide relief for people facing genuine financial hardship can sometimes be exploited by individuals whose problems stem primarily from their own irresponsible choices and destructive behaviours. Upon his discharge from bankruptcy, Hendry was only required to pay back £36,000 of his total £2.1 million debt. This means he was legally absolved from paying back more than 98% of what he owed, an outcome that essentially rewarded his financial irresponsibility while forcing his creditors to absorb the losses created by his poor choices and destructive behaviours. His minimal repayment obligation was set at just £1,000 per month for 3 years, an amount that represented a tiny fraction of his original debt and monthly obligations. This outcome caused immense frustration and what can only be described as incredulity among his creditors, particularly Hector McFarlane, who had lent him £85,000 based on friendship, trust, and genuine concern for his family's welfare during their crisis. McFarlane stood to recover only £1,800 of his substantial loan, representing barely 2% of what Hendry owed him. This outcome vividly illustrates how Hendry's financial recklessness and gambling addiction ultimately destroyed even his strongest and most supportive personal relationships, turning what had been private debts between friends into a public spectacle of animosity, resentment, and bitter legal disputes. The McFarlanes had supported the Hendry family emotionally and financially during their worst crisis, only to discover that their generosity had been exploited to finance gambling addiction and unsustainable spending. The bitterness and sense of betrayal felt by his creditors was entirely understandable and justified. These were people who had trusted Hendry during his family's medical crisis and had provided financial support when he claimed to be experiencing temporary difficulties. Instead of helping a friend through a genuine emergency, they discovered that they had been financing his gambling addiction and supporting a lifestyle that was built on deception and completely unsustainable debt. The contrast between their genuine compassion and support during his family's crisis and his systematic exploitation of their trust and generosity reveals the extent to which his character had been compromised by his destructive choices and selfish prioritizing of his immediate desires over the well-being of people who cared about him, adding another deeply troubling layer to his financial downfall and the destruction of his personal relationships. The McFarlanes accused Hendry of deliberately borrowing money from them while already knowing that he was facing inevitable bankruptcy. This accusation suggests a level of calculated deception and manipulation that goes far beyond simple financial mismanagement or grief-driven poor judgment. If true, this accusation means that Hendry deliberately deceived close friends about his financial situation and prospects for repayment, taking their money while knowing that he would likely never be able to honour his obligations due to his impending bankruptcy. This would represent fraud in the most basic sense, obtaining money through deliberate misrepresentation of material facts about his ability to repay the debt. This accusation was so serious that Hector McFarlane reported Hendry to the police for fraud, believing that he had been deliberately and criminally deceived about Hendry's financial situation and realistic prospects for repayment. The decision to involve law enforcement indicates the depth of McFarlane's sense of betrayal and his belief that Hendry's actions constituted criminal rather than merely civil wrongdoing. While the police ultimately deemed the matter a civil rather than criminal issue and declined to pursue charges, the fact that fraud allegations were made by people who had been among Hendry's closest friends highlights the profound sense of betrayal felt by those who had trusted him during his family's crisis. The police decision may have been based on the difficulty of proving criminal intent rather than the absence of deceptive behaviour. The fraud allegations also demonstrate how Hendry's financial problems had evolved from private difficulties into public scandals that damaged his reputation and relationships beyond any possibility of repair. Even if criminal charges were not pursued, the mere fact that such serious allegations were made by former friends became part of the public record and contributed to the complete destruction of his reputation and credibility. In what appears to be a consistent pattern of refusing to accept full responsibility for his own actions and their consequences, Hendry later attempted to shift blame for his bankruptcy onto external factors beyond his control. He claimed that his financial ruin was primarily the result of poor advice from Kingsbridge Asset Management, a high-end financial advisory firm that was subsequently under investigation for fraud and professional misconduct. Kingsbridge had advised numerous high-profile footballers, including Wayne Rooney and Rio Ferdinand, on investments that later turned sour, particularly film and property investment schemes that resulted in significant tax liabilities for their clients. The firm's subsequent investigation and the arrest of several former employees in connection with fraud allegations lend some credibility to claims that their clients may have been victims of professional misconduct. Several former Kingsbridge employees were eventually arrested in connection with a conspiracy to commit fraud, suggesting that the firm may indeed have engaged in systematic deception of their clients. If these allegations prove accurate, It would mean that Hendry and other footballers were victims of sophisticated financial fraud by professionals who exploited their trust and lack of financial expertise. Hendry expressed his intent to seek compensation if wrongdoing was proven, stating, "I've had a massive disservice done to me financially and advice-wise. You employ somebody to give you advice financially, then you put all your trust in that person. So, when you end up bankrupt because of that, then how does that happen?" This statement presents him as a victim of professional misconduct, rather than someone whose problems stemmed primarily from his own choices and behaviours. While there may be some truth to his claims about receiving poor or fraudulent financial advice, this attempt to shift primary responsibility appears to be yet another example of Hendry's consistent unwillingness to accept full accountability for his situation and its consequences. Even if Kingsbridge gave him genuinely bad investment advice or engaged in fraudulent schemes, this cannot excuse or explain away his gambling debts to Spreadex, his systematic borrowing and exploitation of friends and family members, or his failure to pay taxes to HM Revenue and Customs over multiple years. His attempts to blame external factors present a troubling pattern of someone who consistently refuses to take full responsibility for the consequences of his own choices and behaviours. This pattern would continue to manifest in his subsequent legal troubles and personal relationships, suggesting a fundamental unwillingness to engage in the kind of honest self-examination that would be necessary for genuine personal growth and behavioural change. The financial ruin and personal distress that Hendry had brought upon himself through his own choices unfortunately spilled over into a series of increasingly serious and public legal troubles. These incidents further complicated his post-retirement life and caused additional damage to what remained of his public reputation, transforming him from a respected former footballer into a figure associated with violence, criminal behaviour and public scandal. The bitter dispute over the unpaid £85,000 loan from Hector and Williamina McFarlane escalated dramatically beyond angry letters and legal threats, transforming what had been a private financial matter into a violent and very public confrontation that made headlines across the country and shocked the football community. In June 2012, nearly 3 years after Denise's death and 2 years after Hendry's bankruptcy discharge, the simmering resentment over his unpaid debts and perceived lack of remorse finally exploded into actual physical violence at an Italian restaurant in Lytham. Hector McFarlane, who had been waiting years for any meaningful repayment and was increasingly frustrated by what he perceived as Hendry's continued comfortable lifestyle despite his supposed insolvency, confronted his former friend in a public setting where the encounter quickly escalated beyond angry words. McFarlane's anger had been building for months as he watched Hendry apparently continuing to live comfortably, while owing him substantial money with no realistic prospect of meaningful repayment. The fact that Hendry had received a bankruptcy discharge that legally absolved him of most of his debts, while his creditors received almost nothing in return, had added fuel to McFarlane's sense of injustice and betrayal. The bankruptcy system, designed to provide fresh starts for people facing genuine financial hardship, had allowed Hendry to escape the consequences of his poor choices, while forcing people like McFarlane to absorb the financial losses created by his gambling addiction and irresponsible borrowing. From McFarlane's perspective, Hendry had exploited their friendship during his family's crisis, and then used legal mechanisms to avoid taking responsibility for the consequences of his actions. During the restaurant confrontation, McFarlane's accumulated fury and frustration became uncontrollable. The sight of Hendry apparently enjoying a comfortable evening out while owing him tens of thousands of pounds that would never be repaid triggered an explosive reaction that shocked other diners and restaurant staff. McFarlane physically assaulted both Hendry and his 24-year-old daughter Regan, who had accompanied her father to dinner and became an innocent victim of violence caused by her father's financial irresponsibility. McFarlane punched Regan, knocking her to the floor, before turning his attention to Colin and raining several blows on his back while screaming, "Where's my money?" The violence and profanity of the attack shocked other restaurant patrons and staff. who witnessed a formerly respectable businessman losing complete control due to years of accumulated anger and frustration over Hendry's betrayal of their friendship. The attack on Regan was particularly disturbing, as she had no direct involvement in her father's financial problems, but became a victim of violence due to his poor choices and their consequences. The fact that a young woman was physically assaulted because of debts created by her father's gambling addiction illustrates how destructive behaviours can create ripple effects that harm innocent family members who had no control over the original decisions. The entire incident was captured on the restaurant's closed-circuit television system, providing clear and undeniable evidence of the confrontation and assault that would later be used in criminal proceedings. The video footage showed the unprovoked nature of the attack and the shocking transformation of what should have been a civilized discussion into actual physical violence. Hector MacFarlane, aged 64 at the time of the incident, subsequently pleaded guilty to criminal charges of assaulting both Hendry and his daughter. He was ordered by the court to pay fines and costs totalling £1,026, which included £50 compensation to Regan and £100 to Colin Hendry. While these monetary penalties were relatively modest, they represented formal acknowledgement that his behaviour was criminal and unacceptable. His wife, Williamina MacFarlane, aged 63, was also fined by the court for threatening Regan during the incident. The fact that both members of the MacFarlane couple faced criminal charges demonstrates how deeply Hendry's financial betrayal had affected people who had once been among his closest friends and most loyal supporters during his family's medical crisis. This violent incident vividly illustrates the direct and predictable consequences of Hendry's financial irresponsibility and his systematic exploitation of personal relationships for short-term financial gain. His failure to honour his debts and his apparent lack of remorse or effort to make meaningful restitution had driven a close friend, someone who had literally helped carry his wife's coffin and supported his family through their darkest hours, to commit acts of criminal violence. The fact that his own daughter became a victim of this violence shows how his poor choices and financial deceptions had put his entire family at physical risk and created dangerous situations that could have resulted in serious injury. Regan had done nothing wrong, but found herself knocked to the floor in a restaurant because of debts created by her father's gambling addiction and financial irresponsibility. The restaurant assault was not just an isolated incident of violence between former friends, but a direct and foreseeable result of Hendry's pattern of borrowing money from people who trusted him while having no realistic ability or genuine intention to repay them. The attack demonstrated how financial betrayal can destroy even the strongest personal relationships and lead to consequences that extend far beyond mere money problems into actual physical danger. The public nature of the incident, occurring in a crowded restaurant and captured on security cameras, ensured that Hendry's financial problems and their consequences became matters of public record and media attention. The story of a former Scotland captain being assaulted over unpaid gambling debts made headlines throughout the UK and further damaged his reputation and public image. But Hendry's legal troubles were far from over, and his problems extended well beyond disputes with creditors and former friends. In 2015, further serious legal issues emerged that were directly linked to his admitted struggles with alcohol and his apparent failure to address the destructive coping mechanisms he had adopted after his wife's death. Years earlier, on February 21, 2015, nearly 6 years after Denise's death, Hendry was apprehended by police for drink driving, an offence that put both himself and innocent members of the public at serious risk. The timing of this offence, occurring so long after his wife's death, suggests that his problems with alcohol were not temporary grief responses, but had become ongoing issues that he had failed to address despite years of consequences. His breath test revealed a reading of 63 micrograms of alcohol per 100 millilitres of breath, which was nearly double the legal limit of 35 micrograms established to protect public safety. This wasn't a case of someone who had slightly misjudged their alcohol consumption after a social event, or was just barely over the legal limit due to poor timing. This was someone who was seriously intoxicated and completely unfit to operate a motor vehicle on public roads shared with innocent families and pedestrians. The level of intoxication indicated by his breath test suggests that he had consumed substantial amounts of alcohol before deciding to drive, showing complete disregard for both legal requirements and public safety. His decision to drive while nearly twice the legal limit put countless innocent people at risk of serious injury or death, and demonstrated a fundamental lack of responsibility and consideration for others. Although Hendry initially attempted to contest the drink driving charge in court, claiming there were discrepancies between his claimed alcohol consumption and the breath test readings, he ultimately dropped his legal challenge when it became clear that the evidence against him was overwhelming. His attempt to fight the charges suggests either a continued unwillingness to accept responsibility for his actions or a fundamental misunderstanding of the seriousness of his offence. The decision to initially contest the charges also demonstrates a pattern of denying responsibility and attempting to avoid consequences that had characterised his behaviour throughout his financial and legal troubles. Even when faced with objective scientific evidence of his intoxication, his first instinct was to challenge the charges rather than accept responsibility and seek help for his ongoing problems with alcohol. On April 22, 2015, Hendry was banned from driving for 17 months and received a fine of £110, along with £200 in prosecution costs and a £20 victim surcharge. While these penalties might seem relatively modest for such a serious offence, they represented a direct and public acknowledgement that his problems with alcohol had continued for years after his wife's death and had now escalated to the point where they posed direct threats to public safety. This drink-driving conviction directly links his admitted struggle with alcohol to specific legal consequences and criminal behaviour, demonstrating the tangible and dangerous repercussions of his failure to address his destructive coping mechanisms in healthy or constructive ways. The fact that he was nearly twice the legal alcohol limit shows that his drinking problem was serious and ongoing, rather than occasional poor judgment or temporary lapses. The conviction also occurred more than 5 years after his wife's death, suggesting that rather than processing his grief and addressing his underlying issues through professional help or healthy coping strategies, he had allowed his destructive behaviours to continue and potentially escalate over time. This timeline raises serious questions about his commitment to personal growth and behavioural change. The most disturbing and revealing aspect of Hendry's legal troubles emerged through his treatment of women in his personal relationships, particularly his behaviour toward women who attempted to establish or maintain boundaries in their interactions with him. Following Denise's death, Hendry had entered into a relationship with a beautician named Sarah Kinder, which initially appeared to represent a positive step toward rebuilding his personal life. However, after their relationship ended in early March 2015, Hendry's behaviour toward Ms. Kinder became increasingly problematic and eventually crossed clearly defined legal and ethical boundaries into systematic criminal harassment. His actions went far beyond what might be considered normal post-breakup contact or reasonable attempts at reconciliation between former romantic partners. For a full 2 months following their breakup, from March through April 2015, Hendry engaged in a deliberate and systematic pattern of harassment against Sarah Kinder that revealed deeply troubling aspects of his character and his fundamental attitudes toward women, consent, and personal autonomy. His behaviour demonstrated a complete disregard for her clearly expressed wishes to end their relationship and be left alone. His harassment campaign included sending unwanted text messages and emails to Ms. Kinder on a daily basis, sometimes sending up to 10 messages per day despite her clear lack of response, encouragement, or any indication that continued contact was welcome. This persistent digital harassment showed a complete disregard for her wishes and personal boundaries, as well as a fundamental inability or unwillingness to accept a decision to end their relationship. The volume and persistence of his unwanted communications, up to 10 messages per day over a 2-month period, represents hundreds of unwanted contacts that would have been frightening and overwhelming for any woman trying to move on with her life after ending a relationship. The fact that he continued this behaviour despite receiving no positive responses demonstrates either a complete inability to read social cues or a deliberate decision to ignore them. He also made uninvited visits to her home, appearing at her residence without permission, invitation, or any legitimate reason for being there. This behaviour would have been particularly frightening and intimidating for any woman living alone, as uninvited visits from former romantic partners often escalate into more serious forms of harassment or violence. The decision to appear at someone's home without permission represents a serious violation of personal boundaries and privacy. Most disturbingly of all, Hendry twice threw stones at Sarah Kinder's bedroom window during the night in an attempt to gain her attention and force unwanted contact with her. This behaviour was not the action of someone processing the normal disappointment of a relationship ending or struggling with loneliness in acceptable ways. This was deliberate intimidation designed to frighten and harass a woman who simply wanted to be left alone to live her life without interference. The act of throwing stones at someone's bedroom window in the middle of the night is inherently threatening and would cause any reasonable person to fear for their personal safety and security. This behaviour suggests someone who was willing to use intimidation and the threat of escalation to try to force contact with someone who had made it clear that such contact was unwanted. This pattern of harassment behaviour was not the conduct of a grieving widower trying to cope with loss or loneliness in understandable ways. It was the systematic behaviour of someone who refused to accept that a relationship had ended, and who was willing to intimidate, frighten, and harass a woman to try to force her to maintain contact against her clearly expressed wishes. It demonstrated a fundamental disrespect for women's autonomy and right to make their own choices about personal relationships. The escalation from unwanted messages to physical visits to throwing objects at her window suggests a pattern of behaviour that was becoming increasingly threatening and potentially dangerous. Many cases of serious domestic violence and stalking begin with exactly this type of escalating harassment behaviour that demonstrates a refusal to accept boundaries or respect another person's autonomy. Hendry's harassment of Sarah Kinder only ceased on April 18, 2015, when he was arrested by police on suspicion of both assault and harassment charges. The fact that police intervention was required to stop his behaviour shows that he was not willing to respect Ms. Kinder's clearly expressed wishes to be left alone, even when his actions had escalated to criminal behaviour. The need for arrest to stop his harassment demonstrates that Ms. Kinder's own efforts to establish boundaries and end unwanted contact had been completely ineffective, leaving her with no choice but to involve law enforcement to protect herself from his continuing unwanted attention and increasingly threatening behaviour. He was subsequently charged with harassment without violence and common assault, though the assault charge was later dropped after Ms. Kinder retracted her statement, possibly due to the stress and intimidation often associated with testifying in criminal cases involving personal relationships. The decision to drop assault charges doesn't necessarily mean that assault didn't occur, but often reflects the practical difficulties and emotional costs of pursuing such cases through the court system. Hendry pleaded guilty to the harassment charge, finally accepting legal responsibility for his unacceptable behaviour toward Ms. Kinder and acknowledging that his actions constituted criminal conduct. His guilty plea represented formal admission that his behaviour had crossed legal boundaries and caused genuine distress to another person. On August 20, 2015, he was sentenced to a 12-month community order, which included 100 hours of unpaid work as punishment for his criminal behaviour. While he had been warned by the court that he could face jail time for his actions, he ultimately received a community sentence that allowed him to avoid imprisonment. The community service sentence represented a recognition by the court that his behaviour was serious enough to warrant criminal punishment, but that rehabilitation through community service might be more beneficial than imprisonment. However, the sentence also represented another instance where Hendry avoided the most serious consequences of his actions through legal mechanisms rather than genuine accountability. His lawyer's statement following the sentencing claimed that Hendry was determined that this case marks the end of what can be classed as a blip for him, and expressed his supposed determination never to transgress in any way again. The characterization of systematic harassment as merely a blip seems to minimize the seriousness of his behavior and its impact on his victim. The fact that such a statement was considered necessary in 2015, 6 full years after his wife's death, raises serious questions about whether his problems were really temporary aberrations caused by grief, or had become established patterns of problematic behaviour that reflected deeper character issues requiring more substantial intervention and accountability. These legal incidents taken together, involving violent assault by a former friend over unpaid debts, a serious criminal driving offence while heavily intoxicated, and the systematic harassment of a woman who wanted to end their relationship, represent a dramatic and deeply troubling departure from Hendry's former public persona as a respected national football hero and team captain. The widespread media reporting of these events permanently and severely tarnished his reputation, transforming him in the public eye from a celebrated athlete who had represented his country with distinction into a figure associated with personal scandal, financial irresponsibility, criminal behaviour, and the systematic exploitation of people who had tried to help him. The pattern that emerges from examining Hendry's post-retirement life in comprehensive detail is one of consistently poor choices that compounded into increasingly worse consequences for both himself and everyone around him. His admitted turn to alcohol and gambling after his wife's death might initially have been understandable reactions to overwhelming grief and loss, but these behaviours quickly evolved from temporary coping mechanisms into destructive long-term patterns that caused extensive damage to his relationships, reputation, and community. His systematic decision to borrow large sums of money from close friends and family members, while being fully aware of his precarious and rapidly deteriorating financial position, showed a calculated willingness to exploit the most important personal relationships in his life for short-term financial relief. This wasn't just poor financial management or temporary desperation. It was a deliberate pattern of deception of people who trusted and cared about him during his family's genuine medical crisis. The fact that he specifically asked the McFarlanes to keep their substantial loan secret from his dying wife suggests that he understood the deceptive and potentially shameful nature of his borrowing behaviour, but was willing to continue anyway. He was prepared to lie to his terminally ill wife, while simultaneously taking advantage of their closest friend's generosity, trust, and genuine concern for his family's welfare. His bankruptcy proceedings, rather than serving as a meaningful wake-up call or moment of genuine accountability and behavioural change, seemed instead to provide him with legal protection from the consequences of his irresponsible choices, while forcing others to bear the financial costs of his destructive decisions and gambling addiction. The fact that he was legally required to repay less than 2% of his total debt, while creditors like the McFarlanes lost the vast majority of their money, demonstrates how legal systems designed to help people in genuine distress can sometimes be exploited by those whose problems stem primarily from their own poor choices. The violence that eventually erupted between Hendry and the McFarlanes was a direct and entirely predictable result of his failure to honour his financial obligations, combined with his apparent continuation of a comfortable lifestyle despite owing them substantial money that would never be repaid. The fact that his innocent daughter became a victim of this violence shows how his financial irresponsibility and exploitation of personal relationships put his entire family at physical risk and caused trauma that extended far beyond his own problems. His drink-driving conviction, occurring more than 5 years after his wife's death, demonstrated that his problems with alcohol were not temporary grief responses that he had addressed and overcome, but had become ongoing issues that continued to put public safety at risk and lead to criminal behaviour years after the original crisis had passed. Most concerning of all was his systematic harassment of Sarah Kinder, which revealed disturbing patterns of behaviour toward women that had absolutely nothing to do with grief over his wife's death or any other external circumstances. This behaviour showed a fundamental lack of respect for women's autonomy, personal boundaries, and right to make their own choices about relationships and personal interactions. The harassment occurred years after his wife's death and demonstrated attitudes and behaviours that cannot be explained or excused by grief, financial stress, or any other external factors. This was criminal behaviour that reflected deep-seated problems with accepting boundaries, respecting others' choices, and managing rejection or disappointment in acceptable ways. Throughout this entire period of escalating legal troubles and personal problems, Hendry's consistent attempts to shift blame onto others, whether blaming the McFarlanes for taking legal action against him, claiming his bankruptcy was primarily due to fraudulent financial advice rather than his own gambling addiction, or characterising his criminal harassment as a temporary blip, showed a persistent and troubling unwillingness to accept full responsibility for his actions and their consequences. While external factors such as potentially fraudulent financial advice may have contributed to some aspects of his financial problems, the core issues of gambling addiction, alcohol abuse, systematic exploitation of personal relationships, and criminal harassment of women were clearly the result of his own choices, character flaws, and behavioural patterns rather than circumstances beyond his control. His attempts to minimise responsibility or externalise blame for these behaviours suggest someone who had not genuinely learned from his mistakes, accepted accountability for his actions, or committed to the kind of fundamental behavioural changes that would be necessary to prevent similar problems in the future. The pre-existing financial problems that had emerged well before his wife's death suggest that Hendry's difficulties weren't primarily the result of grief-driven poor judgment or temporary emotional distress, but reflected deeper and more fundamental issues with financial responsibility, impulse control, personal boundaries, and ethical decision-making that may have existed long before his personal crisis, but were revealed and amplified by the pressures he faced. The fact that Spreadex, a gambling company, initiated his bankruptcy proceedings provides clear evidence that his financial collapse was significantly driven by compulsive gambling addiction rather than investment losses, economic circumstances beyond his control, or even the medical expenses associated with his wife's illness. This wasn't primarily about external victimization, but about destructive personal habits and choices that consumed his financial resources and destroyed his economic stability. The devastating impact of Hendry's choices on his 4 children throughout this period cannot be overlooked, minimized, or treated as secondary to his own problems. These young people had already suffered the traumatic loss of their mother after watching her endure years of medical complications and suffering due to preventable medical negligence. They then had to witness and live with their father's very public descent into financial ruin, criminal behaviour, and personal scandal that made headlines throughout the country and became part of their permanent family history. His daughter Reagan even became a direct victim of physical violence as a result of his unpaid gambling debts and the justified anger they generated among people he had exploited. The fact that she was knocked to the floor in a restaurant because of debts created by her father's addiction demonstrates how destructive behaviours create ripple effects that harm innocent family members who had no control over the original decisions or behaviours. The systematic destruction of his relationships with people like the McFarlanes, who had been close enough friends to help carry his wife's coffin and support the family emotionally and practically through their darkest medical crisis, shows how his actions poisoned even his most important and supportive personal relationships. These were people who had demonstrated genuine care, concern, and practical support for his family during their time of greatest need. yet he was ultimately willing to exploit their friendship, generosity, and compassion for money he had no realistic ability to repay. The transformation of these supportive relationships into sources of conflict, legal action, and ultimately physical violence demonstrates the extensive collateral damage created by his financial irresponsibility and character failures. People who should have remained lifelong friends and sources of support instead became adversaries in legal proceedings and ultimately participants in criminal violence. Hendry's story highlights broader issues about the vulnerabilities that professional athletes can face after retirement, particularly around financial management, identity transition, and the development of healthy coping mechanisms for dealing with life's inevitable challenges. However, his case goes well beyond the typical challenges of transitioning from high-earning athletic careers to civilian life, or the normal difficulties of retirement and aging. While many retired athletes struggle with financial management, loss of identity, reduced income, or the psychological challenges of no longer being active competitors, Hendry's problems were significantly compounded and distinguished by his own destructive choices and his systematic willingness to exploit personal relationships for financial gain, regardless of the consequences for others. The allegations involving potentially fraudulent financial advice from Kingsbridge Asset Management do add some complexity to his story and suggest that he may have been victimised by professional misconduct in some aspects of his financial dealings. If these allegations prove accurate, it would demonstrate that Hendry was also a victim of systematic fraud by financial advisors who exploited his trust, lack of financial sophistication, and the natural vulnerability that many athletes face when dealing with complex financial matters. However, even if bad or fraudulent financial advice contributed significantly to some of his investment losses and tax problems, this cannot excuse, explain away, or justify his gambling debts, his systematic exploitation of friends and family members, his drink-driving offence that put innocent people at risk, or his criminal harassment of Sarah Kinder. These behaviours were clearly the result of his own choices, character flaws and behavioural patterns, rather than external victimisation or circumstances beyond his control. The public nature of his struggles due to his status as a former international footballer and team captain certainly created additional complications, pressures, and scrutiny that made his situation more difficult and embarrassing. The widespread media coverage of his legal troubles and financial scandals likely made his personal problems more stressful and may have contributed to his sense of isolation and desperation. However, this public scrutiny also served important functions as a cautionary tale about the potential consequences of poor personal choices, financial irresponsibility, and the exploitation of personal relationships. His case became frequently referenced in discussions about the challenges faced by retired athletes and the importance of developing healthy coping mechanisms and support systems. His attempts at professional rehabilitation and career rebuilding, including his work as a football pundit for ESPN and his continued involvement in coaching positions, suggest some effort to rebuild his career and maintain connections to the sport that had once brought him fame, success, and public respect. These professional activities also provided opportunities to contribute positively to football and potentially serve as cautionary examples for current players about the importance of making good choices both during and after their playing careers. However, the pattern of legal troubles that extended from 2012 through 2015 shows that his personal problems and character issues persisted for many years after the initial tragedy of his wife's death, and continued to create new problems and consequences long after any reasonable grace period for grief-related poor judgment had expired. The community order he received for harassing Sarah Kinder, while allowing him to avoid imprisonment, came with clear judicial warnings and his lawyer's public statement that this needed to mark the end of what can be classed as a blip. The fact that such a statement was considered necessary in 2015, 6 full years after his wife's death, suggests that his problems had evolved from temporary grief responses into established patterns of problematic behaviour that reflected deeper character issues requiring more substantial intervention, accountability, and behavioral change. The timeline of events reveals someone who repeatedly failed to learn from consequences or modify his behavior despite facing increasingly serious legal and personal repercussions. His bankruptcy in 2010 should have served as a clear warning about the unsustainability of his lifestyle, choices, and behavioral patterns. Instead, the restaurant assault in 2012 showed that his problems with former friends and creditors were escalating rather than resolving through time or natural healing processes. His drink driving conviction in 2015 demonstrated that his alcohol problems remained unaddressed years after his wife's death, and had escalated to the point where they posed direct threats to public safety and his own liberty. His harassment of Sarah Kinder in the same year showed that his problems had expanded beyond financial issues into deeply concerning patterns of behaviour toward women that suggested fundamental problems with boundaries, respect, and acceptable social conduct. Each of these incidents should have served as a wake-up call that prompted serious self-reflection, professional intervention, and meaningful behavioural change. Instead, the pattern suggests someone who consistently minimized the seriousness of his actions, externalized blame for his problems onto others or external circumstances, and failed to address the underlying character issues and behavioral patterns that were causing his destructive choices. This represents a fundamental failure of personal responsibility, character development, and emotional maturity that extended far beyond what could reasonably be attributed to grief, trauma, or temporary emotional distress following his wife's death. The persistence of problematic behaviours over multiple years suggests deeper issues that required professional intervention and genuine commitment to personal change. Despite all the troubling aspects of Colin Hendry's post-retirement behaviour and the serious consequences of his consistently poor choices, it remains important to acknowledge and remember the genuine tragedy that initiated his downward spiral and the enormous personal loss that he suffered. The prolonged illness and death of his wife Denise was an authentic personal catastrophe that would challenge anyone's emotional resilience, coping abilities, and capacity to maintain perspective during overwhelming circumstances. The 7-year ordeal of medical complications, multiple failed surgeries, constant uncertainty, and ultimate loss represented a level of sustained trauma and stress that few people are ever forced to endure. The fact that this enormous suffering was caused by clear medical negligence rather than natural illness or unavoidable circumstances added layers of anger, frustration, injustice, and preventable tragedy to an already devastating situation that would have tested anyone's faith and emotional stability. Colin Hendry did demonstrate genuine love and commitment by remaining steadfastly at his wife's bedside throughout her final illness and medical struggles, showing dedication and support during the most difficult circumstances imaginable. This behaviour represents the better aspects of his character during the crisis period, and demonstrates that he was capable of selfless behaviour and genuine love even while dealing with overwhelming stress and uncertainty. His public praise of Denise's courage and resilience during her long battle with medical complications showed genuine appreciation for her strength in facing unimaginable suffering with dignity and determination. These statements reflect his capacity for recognizing and honoring the best qualities in others, even during periods when his own behavior was becoming increasingly problematic. The financial settlement that the family eventually received from the medical negligence case, while providing some measure of justice and financial compensation, could never truly repair the damage done to their lives, restore the years of suffering they endured, or bring back a beloved wife and mother. The surgeon's removal from medical practice and cessation of work in the UK provided some accountability and recognition of responsibility, but this professional consequence could not undo years of suffering or eliminate the permanent loss the family experienced. Hendry has also demonstrated some degree of self-awareness about his mistakes and their consequences, even if this awareness has often seemed insufficient or temporary. His admission that, "I'm not a bad guy, I've made mistakes in my life, like most people have, represents at least some recognition of his responsibility for his problems and acknowledgement that his behaviour had been problematic and harmful to others. While this level of acknowledgement may seem insufficient given the extent and persistence of his destructive actions and their impact on innocent people who tried to help him, it does suggest some capacity for self-reflection and recognition that his behaviour deviated from acceptable standards of personal and social conduct. His lawyer's statement following the harassment case, expressing determination that it marked the end of what can be classed as a blip for him, and his supposed commitment to never transgress in any way again, suggests at least a stated intention to change his behaviour patterns and avoid future legal problems and personal conflicts. While statements of intent and promises of future good behaviour are significantly less meaningful than consistent behavioural change demonstrated over extended periods, they do represent a starting point for potential rehabilitation and personal growth. Hendry has maintained some degree of professional activity and career development following his legal troubles, continuing his involvement in football through coaching positions and work as a football pundit for ESPN. This suggests ongoing efforts to rebuild his career, maintain connections to the sport that once brought him success and recognition, and contribute positively to football rather than remaining focused solely on his personal problems and past mistakes. His continued involvement in football also provides opportunities to contribute positively to the sport he once served with distinction and potentially serve as a cautionary example for current players about the importance of making good choices, developing healthy coping mechanisms and maintaining personal integrity both during and after their playing careers. There has also been some degree of public empathy and understanding for his situation, with people recognising the enormous tragedy he faced with the loss of his wife and the extraordinary circumstances that contributed to his subsequent problems. Comments such as, "This is a tragedy for Colin and his family, and we can only imagine what he has gone through. He lost his greatest asset, Denise. We can all learn from this. You don't know what is around the corner and what effect it may have on you. Good luck, Colin," demonstrate that despite his poor choices and harmful behaviour, there remains public recognition that he faced genuine catastrophe and overwhelming personal loss. This continued empathy highlights the complex relationship between public figures and their audiences, where scrutiny and condemnation during periods of scandal and poor behaviour can coexist with compassion and understanding for the underlying human suffering and extraordinary circumstances that may have contributed to their problems. It also demonstrates society's capacity to distinguish between condemning harmful and destructive behaviour while still recognising the fundamental humanity and potential for redemption in people who have made serious mistakes and caused harm to others. Hendry's story ultimately serves as a powerful and multifaceted reminder of human vulnerability in the face of overwhelming personal tragedy and the complex ways that grief, trauma and loss can interact with existing character strengths and weaknesses to produce either growth and resilience or destruction and harm to ourselves and others. Even those who achieve the highest levels of professional success, public recognition and apparent personal strength remain fundamentally vulnerable to personal catastrophes that can challenge their coping abilities, reveal both the best and worst aspects of their character, and test their commitment to maintaining integrity and ethical behaviour during the most difficult periods of their lives. His case powerfully illustrates how grief and trauma, when combined with poor choices, inadequate support systems and destructive coping mechanisms, can create devastating consequences that extend far beyond the individual to affect family members, friends, creditors, and the broader community in ways that multiply the original tragedy and create additional suffering for innocent people. The progression of his legal troubles and personal problems demonstrates both how early intervention and appropriate support might have prevented the escalation of his difficulties and the fundamental limits of what external support and intervention can achieve when individuals are not ready, willing, or able to address their underlying issues with honesty, accountability, and genuine commitment to behavioural change. Most importantly, His story serves as both a sobering warning about the potential consequences of destructive choices and behavioral patterns, and a testament to the fundamental possibility of redemption, personal growth, and positive change that remains available to all people, regardless of the severity of their past mistakes or the extent of harm they may have caused. While the damage caused by his behavior cannot be undone, and some relationships and opportunities may be permanently affected by his actions, the fundamental human capacity for growth, learning, and positive change remains central to human dignity and social progress. The lessons learned from both success and failure can contribute to personal development and serve as guidance for others facing similar challenges. The lesson of Colin Hendry's Rise and Fall is ultimately about the critical importance of character, integrity, personal responsibility, and ethical decision-making, especially during the most challenging and vulnerable periods of our lives. It reminds us that how we respond to tragedy, adversity, and overwhelming circumstances often defines us more significantly than the circumstances themselves or the external challenges we face. His story shows us that the choices we make during our darkest moments can either compound our suffering and create additional harm for ourselves and others, or begin the difficult process of healing, growth, and recovery that allows us to emerge stronger and more capable of contributing positively to our communities and relationships. For all his failures, poor choices, and the harm he caused to others, Colin Hendry remains a human being who faced unimaginable personal loss and made terrible mistakes in trying to cope with tragedy and overwhelming circumstances. His story offers both a sobering warning about the consequences of destructive behaviour and persistent hope, that even those who fall the furthest and cause the most harm can find their way